All right, so when does the carrier settle? And it's important to consider right off the bat that settlement is voluntary. There's no obligation for the workers' compensation carrier to pay you in a lump sum what they could pay you out over time. They could pay you workers' compensation checks on a weekly basis and hope that you go back to work at some point and never pay a lump sum. And if they don't agree to settle, it's not as though we can file a hearing and make them settle. Now, we can compel them to want to settle by filing a hearing request and making them provide all the compensation you are due under the law. But again, the law doesn't require them to pay a lump sum anywhere. So when they consider settlement, it is almost always a business decision. It is what is going to affect their bottom line. And many of the carriers have got it down to a science about how much they'd be willing to pay in order to settle a claim so they can save $1. So, for instance, if there is a reasonable likelihood that you will be out of work for the maximum number of weeks, which is 500 weeks under the law, but they can pay that over time, they may be willing to settle with you for maybe a little bit less than that in order to avoid having to pay the full amount. Or maybe they'd be willing to pay the 500 weeks as long as they could avoid having to pay any future medical treatment costs. They are never going to pay what the actual cost of your claim is, because that would not be a good business decision. If they could spread out that cost over time, that's what they would want to do. So if you settle, it will only be because the numbers make sense for both you and for the workers' compensation carrier. Remember, it's all voluntary. It's as much voluntary for you as it is for them. So whenever we have a mediation in our workers' compensation claims, we often say that the best settlements are where both parties are really unhappy. It's because they've compromised on something that they wanted. Now, obviously we don't want all of our clients to be unhappy, but just bear in mind that it is a voluntary process and we're negotiating. And maybe you wanted a workers' comp settlement based on the full 500 weeks, but you got 260 weeks, which is maybe 160 more weeks than the workers' compensation carrier was willing to pay, really. So that's a situation where you've really taken advantage of them in that situation, but they didn't, you maybe didn't feel that way. In the end, if you agree on a number, it's going to be paid in a lump sum and it will not be taxed. Now, I am not a tax attorney. No one in my firm is a tax attorney, but in our long experience practicing workers' compensation law, we understand that workers' compensation settlements are intended as compensation for injuries or sicknesses within the meaning of Section 104A1 of the Internal Revenue Code. And I, to this day, have not had a claim where somebody was taxed on their settlement.